Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another lecture in ASU's Center for the Study of Economic Liberty lecture series, Perspectives on Economic Liberty. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. Our goal is to become a leader in research that affects liberty-enhancing policy, increases public and academic awareness of the history and philosophy of economic liberty, and leads to more voluntary, bottom-up governance. Today's lecture also contributes to our goal of leveraging our location in Arizona and the American Southwest to consider topics of importance to our community based on academic research that engages potential policy changes by re-envisioning governance structures. Timely for today because of the President Biden's ruling, or at least it's the start of a process of a discussion of Colorado River water issues. So our speaker today, well, actually, before I introduce Gary, let me just say the center has just released its primary research project, which is called the Doing Business Report. We might say that the metric is the ease of doing business across the United States. And in this issue, also Puerto Rico is now included in the report. And it looks at city levels and examines the differences in business regulation across the life cycle of a business. How easy is it to start a business? How easy is it to get financing? How easy is it to get permits? How easy is, how many brownouts do you have for electricity? All those kind of metrics that engage a business community in terms of thinking about where they might locate or where they find it easier to do business. And that report is here in the folder form, just on the list, but the actual metrics for this, if you want to dive into them, you can publicly download them off of the website that is available with the DBNA report. And I encourage people to look at them and think about possible research projects you might have an interest in engaging. Our speaker today is Gary Leibkap, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and the Department of Economics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Gary last visited Cecil in November 2019 and spoke about the difference between property rights in the United States and property rights in South America. The difference, Gary argued, was due to property right regimes, not in the difference between peoples, but in the difference between the rules that they live under. Gary has been a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research, a member of Harvard's research group on political institutions and economic policy, a senior member at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. That's where Sean Regan, who was here last time, works, and Brian Leonard, who will be talking with Gary afterwards, is also an affiliate of the center, the PERC Center in Montana. He's a faculty member here in the School of Sustainability. So Brian will be joining Gary after Gary's talk to ask Gary some questions before we turn the floor open. But tonight, Gary returns to talk about another Western issue, water. The news from Washington makes today's talk even more important. President Biden proposed to set aside legal precedent and reduce the water delivered to California, Arizona, and Nevada evenly between the three states by as much as 1/4. So he reduced the water delivered by 1/4 and said it had to be evenly distributed. An issue that I am sure he will address from the same kind of perspective as he did 3.5 years ago is the issue of how to look at water in the West here today. I look forward to seeing what he says. So please join me in welcoming Gary to ASU to speak about solutions markets may provide for water shortages in the West, especially in communities that depend upon the Colorado River. Thank you. Gary?
Great to be here. I like heat, and I like sunshine, and I like dry. So the advertisement about the the role of water markets in helping to address Colorado River issues, emphasize water markets. It's a huge area and it covers lots of terrain. And as I started to look at this topic in a little bit more depth a few months ago, it occurred to me that I needed to partition this, and secondly, to focus on where I think there's been a lot of, it's really been overlooked, and that's urban water pricing. And so with that, we're going to spend most of the time, at least in my discussion, on some problems with urban water pricing. And from the beginning, I'll tell you that it doesn't encourage conservation of water, and it's not equitable, okay? And these water price issues have been around for a long time, and not obvious to me how that's going to change. And we'll see that many of the larger urban areas in the Colorado River Basin have reduced per capita consumption, but it has not been through voluntary responses to price signals so much as very costly infrastructure projects. And we'll talk about those. And those do save water at enormous cost, and then the cost of them is rolled back in terms of cost of service charges that are uniformly applied to all ratepayers, rich and poor, okay? And those flat rates tend to offset any tiered rates that you might put into place to encourage more water conservation. So that's sort of the gist of the talk, and so let's go ahead. And so this is a standard story that we're all familiar with here, and that we heard about, of course, today. People like it here. This is the fastest growing part of the country. There's more industry coming here. This is probably the single most valuable agriculture in the country, if you include also the Central Valley of California, but really the Imperial, Palo Verde irrigation districts in Yuma and so forth. It's 2/3 or more of all of the fruits and vegetables grown in the country. For that reason, I'm a little more pessimistic than many about how much water we're going to squeeze out of agriculture and ship to urban areas. I think there are downsides to that. First off, a lot of that water is very high valued water. These farms are incredibly efficient, and so they squeeze every drop that they can, so they haven't overlooked things particularly. And if you get mandated cutbacks, food prices start to rise. Politicians are very nervous about inflation already. You can imagine the reaction that could take place should food prices start to rise. And moreover, we become more dependent upon imports from Peru, possibly Mexico and elsewhere, if U.S. agricultural production declines. And that's only one aspect of that, of course. In any event, it's critical ag. In California, it's called big ag to make industrial ag, to kind of give a pejorative term to it. But at the end of the day, it's agriculture. All right? We live in an area that is incredibly beautiful. We want to preserve, have some environmental water and so forth, and we're faced with drought. And then we have this new federal report. So, as I just mentioned, agriculture is not a big lake that we're going to be able to draw on, I think, to provide more water to urban areas. This is the most highly urbanized part of the country as well. So there might be some low-valued ag in terms of low-valued use of water around the edges, but I don't think there's probably that much. At least I haven't seen the estimates that indicate that there are. And so we have a lot of high-valued ag. It could very well be that water is more valuable in agriculture than in urban areas or in the environment, although we have less sense of how valuable that might be. So that's why I thought, well, what about urban? What's going on there? And that's when I started to, as I read more and looked at studies and started to get a better sense of things, I got a better idea of what some of the problems are and what some of the options are. Urban is about 20% or roughly of water consumed. So we're talking about a pretty big share of Colorado River water. And it is true that many cities in the Colorado River Basin have reduced consumption per capita. But this is not generally, as we'll see, due to pricing, but due to pretty costly infrastructure. Okay? And we'll talk, as I said, a little bit more about that. So the cost per gallon saved is quite high in many cases. Most of the studies that I have gone over, especially by economists, indicate that water is priced too low. Okay. And that certainly could be the case in the sense that Phoenix advertises, for example, that it has affordable water, which is not quite the advertisement I probably would make or give out in the midst of a crisis, ostensibly a crisis that we're concerned about, a large growing city, and yet saying our water is affordable. There are other adjectives you might use, but affordable doesn't seem to fit with the notion that we're facing a water crunch. Also, many other economic studies indicate that water just isn't affected by price, that the demand is so inelastic or insensitive that consumers don't respond to shifts in price. Unfortunately, there's really no statistical data to back that claim, and I'll show you why in one sense, because it's so complicated to get a sense of what a water price is in any city. But that being said, if water prices are low, as they generally are, all things equal, we're going to be in the more inelastic portion or insensitive portion of the demand curve potentially. So if it's true that water demand is not that sensitive to price change, it in part is because water may be priced too low. It also varies, of course, importantly, across income, with relatively lower income people consuming less per capita and higher income people consuming more per capita, often in landscaping and other attributes like that. And the kinds of infrastructure that I've been referring to that are highly touted by water supply organizations in all major cities as important contributors to conservation. Gray water recycling, that includes a lot of piping and so forth, the infrastructure. Stormwater collection, piping and storage. Turf removals, paying people to tear up their lawns and so forth. Mandating water-efficient appliances, building construction, and then in the most extreme, desalinization. And these can be advertised as saving water, and they certainly can. But it's a very expensive way to save water, and it's not the only way to save water. Pricing would likely be a much more effective way of responding to shifts in water supply. Now, there are not many clear studies out there, as I said, about differences in pricing and the effect on consumer demand for water. This is one study. It's almost 10 years old now, and it's not a statistical study, but it does compare two places very similar, Tucson and Phoenix, in terms of, at that time, that had very different, and still do, very different consumption charges for water. And so Tucson, at that time, and for many years, has had a block or tiered pricing system. I'll show you what that looks like. And you can see that at that time, the average household consumed about 7,500 gallons per month and paid about $28. It seems like almost free at that time, but nevertheless. Phoenix still has flat rates in the summer and a different flat rate in the winter. And a similar household in the study consumed about almost 21% more than the average Tucson consumer. Okay? And the rates were about $22 per month. So it was cheaper, and it was flat. There was no stepping up in terms of as you consume more, you paid more. This is not statistical analysis, but it's suggestive that prices actually could have an effect. Just as an aside, for many years, my family and I lived in Tucson, and my son's job was to clean the pool. Sounds, for many people in other parts of the country, like he had a pool, but you know when you live here, it almost comes with the plumbing. And so part of that was to drain part of all the water and then turn start and refill the pool. And I don't know how old he was, maybe 11 or 12, and a friend of his came over and they decided they had something really had to do, and so he did it. And he left the water in the pool filling, and then he was gone for the rest of the day. And then no one knew about it until in the middle of the night. I heard it sound like there was a river outside, and there was, because it was flowing out. Well, we got almost $1,000 water bill because we had stepped across so many boundaries of the block rate tiered pricing system in the city. And I appealed that and got it cut in half, I think. But even so, you know, that was a big hit for that time. I don't think my son ever did that again, but in any event. This is from that same study, but you get an idea here of differences in per capita water use, Tucson being much lower than Scottsdale. Of course, there are differences in lot size and per capita income, but and certainly lower than as well as Phoenix, and differences in the landscaping associated with the two communities or two areas. And so these are gallons per capita per day. Now, returning just for a moment to this notion of price sensitivity, because this comes up a lot, that consumers just don't respond, and I don't know why that would be, why somehow water would be so different. Now, you can imagine basic water, you know, for household consumption and things like that, to be very insensitive to price change. But beyond that, it's hard to imagine why water demand would not be as responsive to price changes as other important commodities. But nevertheless, if the price is too low, in this range, this is where demand is relatively insensitive. It just doesn't pay to be responsive. Okay? At the upper end of that demand, where prices are higher, then demand is more responsive to price change. It matters. Okay? And so there is it depends where the price is, whether or not price matters. And we just saw we had that sort of suggestive study. But when prices are too low, it really doesn't pay much to conserve. Okay? You're saving something, but it's not costing you much if you don't save, and your neighbor's not on your case about it, and nor is the city water agency. On the other hand, because people don't save, don't conserve when water's cheap, and they let the water run down the street if they're watering their yards or whatever, that is pointed to by many as a signal of sort of inherent wasteful use by consumers. And so we have to do something about this. And this is very prevalent in California, that some activity has to be taken, one of which, of course, is we need more water conservation infrastructure investment, okay, that we just talked about. We need to put some mandated restrictions on landscaping, because otherwise people won't do it. And we have water use days, and then local monitoring by your friendly neighbors. And in Santa Barbara, we lived in a condominium, so we didn't have this problem, but friends of ours actually were stunned when their neighbor, who they'd lived next to for years, turned them in for not watering on their water day. And after that, the relationship never went back to the way it was before. You can see how corrosive that kind of local monitoring is. It seems very Stalinist in some sense. But the other problem with these mandates, and we even saw it today in this report, that's not going to happen, by the way, but the point is it doesn't weigh relative values. So some water is very valuable in some uses and less valuable in other uses. But in the political process, those subtleties get squeezed out. And if you're a rich country, you can kind of, I guess, afford some of these things. But in general, it's not a good way to address a valuable resource like water and manage it in a time of increased scarcity. And I put down here, values differ depending on the use. For water, mandates typically do not, because they're not that subtle and they're not that flexible, but prices can adjust. And that's why we're emphasizing voluntary responses to price signals. The other problem with the emphasis on constructing this infrastructure is water supply organizations that are investing in this have to figure out, well, how much water do we have to save? How much water do we have to conserve? Or where do they get that information? Because the amount of water consumed depends on price. But if you don't have price signals, then you don't really know what future demand might look like. And so they have a variety of engineering studies to indicate, well, how much water do we have to save and return to the system? Okay. But it lacks key information. In a cost-benefit class that I taught at UC Santa Barbara, when Santa Barbara was considering this desalination plant, I went to the water agency in Santa Barbara and offered to have the students, who are very good, do a cost-benefit analysis. Agency wasn't so interested. So at the end of the day, it's very expensive to upgrade, and this was an old desalination plant, to get it back on board and so forth. But the bottom line is it probably would never satisfy any standard benefit cost analysis. The other problem is that we're going to see, and I think this is very damaging for price signals, as I mentioned, these cost of service charges. That is, the water supply agency invests in this costly infrastructure. It's got to pay for it. There's debt out there that has to be serviced. It has to be maintained. And so those cost of service charges are uniformly passed on to consumers, and it tends to make any step or rate increase that otherwise would reflect consumption, block rate increase, as I showed you for Tucson, for example, much flatter. And in some cases, the cost of service charges are greater than the consumption charges. So when you combine those with a water bill, and you're looking at your monthly water bill, it's all you're going to see the bottom line price, and that's what you'll pay, okay? It's going to be difficult for you to dig out, well, how much of that is my consumption that I can cut back on, and how much of that is due to these costs of service charges that are uniformly applied. So they undermine the ability of price signals to tell consumers to cut back when we want them to. The other problem is these mandates on various kinds of infrastructure with water efficiency attributes raise the cost of housing just at a time when we're worried about the cost of housing. And then I said, it's inequitable. If we really wanted to be efficient about all this, which we're not as a society, but we could be more efficient if we want to stay rich or wealthy, what we want is to have some kind of equality about different solutions. So some of this could be gray water storage, and some of it could be stormwater storage, and some of it could be turf removal, and all those kinds of things. But the cost per gallon saved would be roughly equal to what it would cost a consumer to cut back for a commensurate amount. Okay? So the idea is we get some kind of equality across these different solutions in terms of their costs. This gives you an idea for those of you who don't spend your time in the evening looking at block rate pricing for fun. So this just gives you a rough idea. So oftentimes the low block is for basic use, in a home. And so long as you're within this range, it's relatively inexpensive. Okay? It's meant to be. Water isn't like other resources. It's essential for life and the quality of life and so forth. But once you go beyond that, then it becomes increasingly costly, as the Tucson example indicates. Now, I don't want to indicate that this is easy, because you do have to have a way to signal to consumers that they're about to step over this and so forth. But this is not impossible if we wanted to do it. Okay? Alternatively, this is the kind of flat rate pricing that exists, for example, in Phoenix, but it does vary across seasons, of course. But the point is that as you consume different amounts, the consumption charge does not change. And so that's quite a different arrangement relative to this block pricing system. And when I started this, I actually thought I was going to be looking at block pricing and flat rate pricing. It turns out most cities in the Colorado Basin have some kind of block pricing system. Many of these prices are quite flat and also are not that steep, so they're not that costly. There's a huge political, it's much easier, frankly, for local politicians and others to advertise some new infrastructure. Sounds good. What's a voter or a consumer to know? We're going to save some water, we're going to build this plant and so forth. On the other hand, they come back and say, hey, we're going to double your water prices or raise them by a third or whatever. You know, it's something people know. And there's a fair amount of pushback on that. So you can understand the kind of bias on this. That being said, pricing is what is really needed in order to address the Colorado River problem. Ultimately, one way or another, urban areas are going to have to look different in terms of their water consumption in the region. So this, I just put this in so you get an idea what happens when you have these uniform rates, cost of service rates applied. And then if you combine those with regular consumption pricing, regardless of whether they're higher or lower, they make the whole pricing system much flatter. So you're not rewarding consumers for consuming less water or punishing them for consuming too much water, but rather it's going to be fairly uniform. And so that undermines conservation. It also, as I said before, it's not equitable because lower income people do consume less water per capita than do wealthier people. So if you're concerned about equity, not equitable. But you can see, so we end up with a relatively flat pricing, relatively low pricing, and much of the conservation effort offloaded on very costly infrastructure. Now, I'll give you some idea of how costly that stuff is. Well, first off, let me just show you. I've pulled up some bills just to give you an idea, although, you know, maybe again, at night, this is the kind of exciting stuff that my kids always thought that I did, read about, but in any event. So here we have, this is basically flat cost of service pricing, water-based facility charge. Now this is a consumption charge. And so when they add those two, this is your current water charge. And then we'll skip sewer. And then we get a rate case expense surcharge. A rate case expense surcharge, that's for sewer. regulatory assessment fee, deferred capital expense surcharge, deferred capital, well, that's for sewer again. But the point being is you start to add all of these numbers up. You're a consumer and you say, what do I have to pay? That's what you pay. And so the incentive signals that rising prices would convey to you get lost. Now here, as I don't have the cost of service in here. I thought I did, but it didn't. But I just wanted you to see, this is, I think, from Albuquerque, but basically, or Santa Fe, but it just shows they give each consuming household a water budget to remind them where they are in terms of their different, I showed you earlier the steps, and I said it's not so simple for a consumer to know exactly when they're about to step over that. Well, at the end of the month, the water supply organization or agency tells them where they were. And so this is the least expensive water, and then as you start to move up, and then this is the most expensive water, and then they give you some handy adjectives to remind you where you are in terms of your water use. But the point is, there are some signals there. And if they're not clouded by these cost of service charges, then they could be something a consumer would see and say, hey, you know, we're going to cut back in this area or something. We're spending too much money on water, or there are other problems with the overall scarcity of water, and we're going to cut back. Okay? So in this case over here, it's on the left, very complicated to sort this out, and on the right side, much simpler. I just wanted to give you an idea of, as I said, most cities in the Colorado Basin have some kind of tiered rate system. This doesn't tell you how steep it is, but it's quite a change from maybe 10 years ago when most had flat rates. Okay? So Phoenix stands out in its volumetric or uniform pricing across seasons. But Salt Lake, Albuquerque, Denver, and so forth. So pricing then is the untapped mechanism to encourage more water conservation. And we're going to have more water conservation. It's hard to have politicians in Washington, D.C., and agency officials in Washington, D.C. to have this kind of big announcement of an upcoming crisis we're all familiar with, but now they're going to do a variety of mandated cuts through the political process without a greater sense that it's not business as usual in urban areas anymore. And maybe it hasn't been in a couple, but by and large, in most urban areas, things look pretty green, actually. And so we need something where total pricing rises with consumption. So that's a block rate system. And then it allows individuals to make the decision. So you wouldn't have, for example, a Las Vegas style mandated, and they paid, cut back in turf. Okay, and other landscaping. You don't have to do that if consumers actually have to pay to water and maintain the turf. Okay, they'll cut back on their own, right? Otherwise, it's very hard to know, well, how much do I pay you? What's your turf worth? And all that kind of stuff. You don't have to do that if individuals are making those decisions. The agency has a much more difficult time. These kinds of things would allow individuals to make a cost-benefit comparison of the different ways in which they might respond to increased water scarcity. As I said, currently, most of the focus is on infrastructure investment. Data on water saved, not on the cost of that water saved. Okay? And there are a variety of political interests that are quite happy with this arrangement. Unfortunately, not good for water, not good for us, but if you think of a place like Phoenix as urban sprawl, and you want to Constrain it? Well, let's not give them water. Okay? See, that's not dealing with water. That's dealing with a different agenda. Okay? But those are the kinds of things that come up from time to time that sort of capture the legitimate concern about how to deal with a growing water crisis in urban consumption with a bunch of other agendas. And it's quite unfortunate. Let me give you some idea now on how costly this is. And I don't have comparisons across different kinds of infrastructure projects, but you can get an idea these are not inexpensive. Okay? So this is from the Public Policy Institute of California, where they were trying to get a sense of how much does this cost in California for different kinds of infrastructure. So this is recycled water. And I want to be clear, these are not necessarily comparable because I don't have information about the infrastructure itself, so we could make them comparable and then look at the cost of different kinds. But I just wanted you to see that these things cost. Okay? So these are the average annual costs per acre foot for recycled water. Stormwater capture, again, it depends on the scale. Desalination, but this does not include initial construction, which of course is huge. And there are some other issues with desal. There are a variety of consumer adjustments that is rolled in California, a variety of credits and incentives for water efficient appliances, and as I said, turf removal. All these are expensive, okay? But if we relied less on these kinds of things and more on pricing, it would have two effects. One is we wouldn't necessarily need the scale of the infrastructure because the amount of water consumed by individuals would be less, okay? And secondly, consumers would adjust on their own, decide, well, what do I want, a water efficient appliance, or do I want something else? Just another little side story. So we bought some new appliances, and we have a very water efficient washing machine. Unfortunately, it doesn't wash unless I run it twice, but it does save water each cycle. It just says it needs 2 cycles now to complete it. So anyway. So in the future, to kind of wrap this story up, I'm emphasizing urban pricing, which I said when I started on this, I didn't realize what kind of an empty hole this was going to be. It would allow individuals to decide how to respond to increased need for water conservation, and we're going to have that, of course. It would make infrastructure more cost effective because we'd have a better sense of exactly how much water is being consumed in an urban area. We would help to avoid these eye-popping headlines that you see, for example, well, this one about Arizona developers, and they have to truck water and all that kind of crazy stuff. There was an article in The Economist, not written by economists, I hope, but nevertheless, Phoenix being the least sustainable city on the planet. And I thought, oh, come on. How can that be? But nevertheless, as I mentioned, there are just so many complex political motives in water conservation. And it could be that new development in the Phoenix area, in the Valley of the Sun, is the highest value of water around, okay? Maybe not in some very high-valued ag, but it could be very high-valued water. So you wouldn't want to put a lot of restrictions on that in terms of how much water these new developments might have access to. It could be very socially and economically valuable water, and we want to make that flow. And then the parts of the community that are shifting that water would be compensated in that process and make adjustments as well. Because price signals would be telling them in one place to cut back and sell water elsewhere. So that's a water market. I mentioned earlier, I think it's very likely that in fact, a lot of agriculture down here probably has extremely high valued use of water, and I don't think we're going to squeeze much more out of it. despite today's statement that California, the states will be cut back proportionately. That will fall heavily on food production, food prices, employment, all the kinds of things that matter to us as a society and politicians are very sensitive to. And if we have more information on relative values across different uses in urban areas, across different uses within urban areas, different uses between ag and urban areas, then we can make more efficient and effective decisions about water conservation. And as this crisis, which is going to happen, I mean, there's just no way around it, one way or another, unfolds. So, at any rate, thanks very much. And I wanted to kind of go over this, but I'm happy to respond to questions that you might have about.
They're going to ask questions after.
Oh, we're going to have this first. Oh, okay. So. Oh, all right.
Yeah, I think are we on? Yeah? Okay. Well, thanks, Gary. That was great. So maybe the first question that some folks in the audience might have is given all of this institutional inefficiency, what can individuals do to help address water scarcity?
Well, what do you do? I mean, seriously, I think most people respond to higher water prices, for that matter, higher prices in general, in reasonable ways. When we were in Santa Barbara and in Tucson, of course, we were very careful with water, not because somebody was sort of, poking you in the back, but we just were. Water is expensive. It was scarce. We were all aware of that. And so I really did not see water running down streets, so I don't know. Anyway, so I actually don't have any words of advice on that so much as I'm just confident that you all have a good sense of what you do. By the way, we're living in Missoula right now where there's a lot of water, a lot of winter, but a lot of water. I'm not nearly so worried about if the hose runs too long or things like that. Water's cheap, it's very abundant, and it's not like Tucson or Santa Barbara.
So that brings me into, I have a follow-up question about that, I think. So when I moved here from Santa Barbara, middle of the drought, I was struck by, you go out to eat in Santa Barbara and it's like they don't bring you water unless you ask for it. Everybody is very water conscious. And I was struck by how much less that seems to be the case here. Do you think that has to do with the prices that restaurants are paying? Do you think it has to do with a culture of conservation? What do you think it drives those kind of differences?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm very suspicious about culture of any kind of thing because with people being very heterogeneous, they're going to have different values and so on. When you're kind of have a uniform notion of what's acceptable, it makes me a little uncomfortable because you might not fit in. Right? That being said, water is relatively inexpensive here, and so that I do think it's pricing. I don't know whether or not what it's like in Tucson. I haven't gone out to a restaurant there in some time. Whether they bring you a glass of water when you walk in, but in any event, yeah.
So as I was looking at your slide on kind of all of these expensive ways of augmenting urban water supply, whether it's turf removal or something else like that, probably the biggest infrastructure investment I could think of in the context of water in Arizona is the Central Arizona Project. So I wanted to get your take on the Central Arizona Project. If we look back on it, even now, but even 25 years from now, what's the post-mortem on the cap in 2050? Is it a good investment? Is it a bad investment? How do we know if it's a good investment or a bad investment, given all of the uncertainties you've told us about? How should we think about that?
That's a wonderful question, actually. And you could address that with, I think, a standard benefit cost analysis. And there are all sorts of, those aren't simple, but it's not impossible, and they've got to be out there. But my off-the-cuff response is it was enormously valuable. Now, why would I think that? Well, water is being brought from the Colorado Basin that Arizona hadn't claimed before. It was Arizona's share at the time. And so it was either going to the Imperial or Palo Verde, various irrigation districts further downriver, or Mexico, or perhaps all the way to the Gulf of California. That water was then, now it's costly to bring it here, I won't deny that, but that water was brought here. You could factor all that into a benefit cost analysis. People came from everywhere to live here. Industry came here. It sustained agriculture. And so by any signal of the response to the access to water in this area indicates it was enormously socially and economically beneficial. So, like I said, I would be stunned if people haven't done a benefit cost analysis of the CAP, but I would also be very skeptical if it wasn't dramatically beneficial relative costs, even including all the high costs of pumping it up over, what was it, 3,000 feet or whatever, and shipping it 300 miles all the way to Tucson. Whether it paid to send it to Tucson, I don't know, but certainly to the Phoenix area, yes. But by the time it's here, maybe gravity flow takes the rest of it to Tucson, I don't know. Yeah.
All right, maybe one last question for you, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So as we think about kind of what the Department of the Interior put on the table today, I think it's kind of picking through it. There's two options, basically. One is kind of a seniority-based cut, which is a little bit closer to what the law of the river says. It's not great for Arizona. And the other is this kind of idea of a proportional cut. How might markets or prices help? You know, is there another way we could think about making those reductions? If we need to make big reductions on the Colorado, how can we use markets or prices to help us do that? How would that compare to what's being proposed by Interior now?
Yeah, that's another really useful question. Well, let's see, how do I want to respond? Well, first off, if we engage in more conservation in the ways I described here, of course, even as our population grows, per capita consumption, and this is the most highly urbanized part of the country, so we cut back urban demand, then per capita, the pressure on the water resource will be reduced. So that's a way in which price signals could be helpful, and markets could be helpful. Like I said, I'm pretty skeptical that we're going to squeeze more water out of ag, a little bit perhaps, but I don't think so much, at least less than many people might think. The federal government and other state governments could be helpful here if they facilitated the trade of water, private trade of water across state lines. It's prohibited by many states. It's very, very difficult where it's not prohibited. But for example, if you had high value demand for water here in Phoenix, for example, and some irrigation district, the Imperial Irrigation District or Palo Verde or what have you, had some water, it'd be valuable water, but not as valuable as what you proposed, you could buy it from, or have a long-term lease, or whatever. But you'd be going across state boundaries. Right now, those trades all have to be within the confines of a state, and so it limits the market participants, it limits the different kinds of values that are competing for water. So that would be a real useful institutional innovation, a removal of an institutional constraint, so that you could actually trade water across state lines. Another example of that isn't this part of the Colorado Basin so much, but you may have seen, well, I think it was probably last December, thereabouts, that Nebraska was planning to build this, and may still very well be, this very costly canal system to move the Platte water around a variety of diversion areas in Colorado to make sure that it gets to Nebraska. And there are going to be all sorts of fights about that. A better option there, to be honest, would be for those who are wanting to secure water in Nebraska, to buy it from people in Colorado or elsewhere in the Colorado drainage, for that matter, given the way this thing works. And then you have a seller and a buyer who both have incentive to ensure that water is transported and that kind of exchange takes place effectively. Under the current arrangement, you don't have those individual incentives there, and you have these kind of massive infrastructure projects that may or may not have much impact on water. But see, these are the kinds of sort of incremental adjustments that can be very critical in responding to growing water shortages, and gives us flexibility in responding to water. So, for example, a very wet period like we had this year, then we would want to do a lot more recharge, a lot more storage. So you're a water broker, you go out, you buy water and store it, perhaps in Lake Powell or Lake Mead, as a water bank for other times. Those things are very difficult to do under the current arrangement.
Great. Thanks, Gary. I think maybe we'll open it up for questions from the rest of the audience here.
Hello? Okay, good.
Yeah.
So the things that you were showing us were residential flat rates in Phoenix, and is there price discrimination on the industrial uses? Because I think that's probably a bigger use, and they're definitely more price sensitive. Is there any movement?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I can't. Now, of course, with the expansion of chip production and things here, that's very relatively water intensive in the Phoenix area, that might be different. By and large, southwestern cities are residential cities, and so a large share of the water consumed by residential users. Now, it could be that with this expansion and so forth in Chandler and wherever, that M&I construction or demand for water is high. And I don't have, and they tend to actually get preferential rates as part of these deals to get cut and what have you. But it's probably quite high valued water. So, I don't know. But see, those are the kinds of things, to be honest, what I thought, well, what shall I was trying to get something that I would be interested in, that I thought would be useful for the group of us to discuss. And I was kind of surprised at how little was out there. At least, maybe that was my search, or maybe there just it was less than I'd hoped.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed and approve of everything you're saying. I have a question, though, and one of the things you've mentioned a couple of times is your estimate, probably. This is probably the value in this case, probably the value in that. And it seems to me one of the fundamental arguments for markets is to reveal the value. So when you can indeed get some of the benefits of a market by imitating pricing structures and having those incentives, but there's really no way to know whether consumers would like more expensive clothes from the cotton, or and have more housing in Phoenix, or cheaper cotton and less housing, and unless they can exchange with one another. So it seems maybe the more fundamental thing is the market, rather than pricing a given quantity of water in 20% of the market, really having people be able to show their demand in some kind of exchange with farmers and urban markets, so that entrepreneurs will be able to estimate what they think consumers will want. But without a market generating those prices, the information content is going to be much less. And maybe the specific example, I don't know enough about it, but about a year ago there was all these articles about an alfalfa deal that happens near Phoenix. So people producing things where they're not paying the opportunity cost of the water. So what are the technical and institutional barriers and opportunities for actually creating markets where entrepreneurs can buy water from farmers, where they shut down a quarter of their field and give it to someone who's trying to grow, put new housing in Phoenix. What are the technical and institutional barriers and opportunities for getting that kind of exchange where people can show what their demands are through their purchasing and not purchasing?
Well, everybody heard that's a tremendous comment, and he says there are multiple barriers. On the ag side, if agriculture is not paying the opportunity cost of water for whatever reason, then I think you have a case that there may be some inefficient or excess water uses in certain areas. And I'm not familiar with the particular case at hand. Alfalfa comes up often as a culprit, as an example of, especially if it gets shipped to China. And in California, of course, there's almonds. And my wife and I are recently at a dinner party that I won't be invited back to, but people are talking about grapes, how water-intensive grapes were and so forth and so on. I just asked him if he was going to drink the rest of his wine before, but anyway, no one thought that was very funny. But the point is, if ag is paying the opportunity cost of the water, then it's kind of irrelevant what they're growing. Okay, if they're not, then I think that's an issue. And so then, I don't have a magic solution there, but you might want to know why it is. Now, within irrigation districts, it's often the case that the irrigation district gets water at a prescribed low price, but then it prices it across its members at kind of the market rate. Okay, so individual members of the irrigation district actually pay something beyond the $20 per acre foot that I believe Imperial has to pay. So I think in their decisions, they're much more influenced by market signals. So to be honest, I'm pretty optimistic about getting information about from market signals about the value of agricultural water and opportunities to sell and trade it, especially if you can across spatial distances. The problem, I think, is within urban. So I believe you were saying, well, I'm an entrepreneur, I want to buy some water, and I want to sell it, okay? You have to have a water supply organization that wants to buy that water at the price you want to sell it. Now, maybe there's some out there, but then they have, in other words, the water supply organization has to be, in a sense, wanting to acquire more costly water and then make that available to consumers for a variety of uses and opportunities. And that'll be in competition within their budgets with the various infrastructure projects that they have underway. And so there are some constraints, but if there weren't constraints out there, this wouldn't be an interesting place to live, right? So, but I actually think it's going to be on the urban side that an entrepreneur will have some more challenges. But that's what entrepreneurs are for, to kind of dig around. And there are many water supply organizations in this area, and so there might be some that are more responsive to buying water that you have managed to acquire from certain irrigation districts or agricultural users.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Labcap. It's great to finally meet you. I've read your book, Environmental Markets, with Terry Anderson. I thought it was fascinating. As a senior, it's actually very cool for me. I had a bunch of comments and questions. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. So I'm looking at your presentation, and I've lived in different cities across the world, and I've seen different types of ways by which people actually deal with the problem of managing water. So, for example, some years ago in South Africa, Cape Town, the city water facility.
I'm going to come just a little closer. I'm just not hearing you very effectively. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Maybe it's better now. Yeah.
Oh, I usually don't talk loud sometimes. Okay. But so in South Africa, I had an example of where the city water board had problems providing water for its customers, then sort of kind of created some type of adjustments by allowing private entrepreneurs, if they could, sell water to consumers. And then they realized that people stopped using the city water. And they stopped that process because they felt that they used the cost of service approach, and they felt that that was affecting the rate base of the water facility. So my question is, or one of my questions is, can that be implemented in American cities, especially in the Southwest? Number one. And number two, living in Arizona, I realized that drinking the water here from the tap is nasty. So I never do that, ever. And I always buy water. And anytime I go to the store, there is always water to buy. So to me, there's a market for drinking water. Does that play any role in how people use water? Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of plastics, and I don't think that's good for the environment. But I would never want to drink that water from the tap at all.
Well,
so how does that? How do cities address this? You know, I don't know if that's even a question or a comment.
yeah, I don't know. Well, yeah, well, you know, the nice thing is you have those options. Drinking from the tap, it's there. You can buy bottled water if you prefer. In many poor places, of course, you don't have that option. So, you know, that's not really an answer, but it's part of our overall water consumption demand, and you do have to pay for it for bottled water, of course. But the concern I had in terms of cities in the southwestern U.S., the water pricing is not reflective of really the true value of water. Okay.
Very nice talk. The last report I read was agriculture is about 70% residential, and commercial is about 22%, and industrial is about 6% in the Phoenix metropolitan area. My hiking buddy's immigrated from China. He thinks the water is fabulous here. He was amazed that people can drink it straight from the tap. But my question is, can you comment about the aquifers? Where do the aquifers fit into the pricing and the legal constraints in restricting access to the aquifers, both on a residential but mainly an agricultural standpoint?
So I'm not quite sure what, I mean, I know the issues of the links between surface and subsurface water, and if you deplete surface, then often you resort to groundwater, substitution.
The city of Mesa, I think, uses like 40% as groundwater from city of Mesa is about 40%. So if the aquifer goes down, will people, what's the legal ramifications of people draining the aquifer, and what can the state actually do? And will pricing fit into that?
Well, see, that seems like an ideal place for pricing to be a lot more aggressive, okay? If you get some signals that the aquifer is being drawn down to some critical levels that could cause subsidence or other problems, then that ought to be the time that you get these price adjustments. Then people cut back, okay? Right now, it doesn't happen like that because, as a residential consumer, how would I know, okay? Or how would I respond to that? I don't think that, but see, pricing would allow you to be responsive. Do you see that, the point? Well, now that is another, yeah.
They're called active management areas.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of them around the state established in Arizona. So it's generally municipalities that are managing those areas. Department of Water and Resources, state of Arizona, that sort of thing.
But the aquifers are much, much larger than each one of these individual.
The active management areas are around aquifers.
Okay, all right.
And they vary, and there could be layers of them.
Yeah.
And so, but they are problematic, there's no question, because they're not observable. We have less information about the conductivity of the water as it moves and so forth. And it varies, importantly, about where you take it, where recharge takes place and so forth. So, and then, at the end of the day, there are no clear property rights to groundwater. And so in the case of surface water, as Brian and I think that is the miracle, frankly, for the Western U.S. and Canada and a few other places in the world, that surface water is privately owned, which allows for markets. For the rest of the world, it's going to always be a political and bureaucratic decision because it's not owned, and it's a mess. Just as a side, I was recently reviewing a paper for groundwater issues in India. And they have these shallow aquifers that have to be filled during the monsoons. And there were these small, poor farmers, and there were better off, larger farmers also accessing the same aquifer. But they had different political agencies that supported them. And the small farmers were more numerous, wanted more pumps as the aquifer was being turned down, which is just the opposite of what you'd want. But you can understand what they were concerned about. And the larger farmers wanted no more, they wanted halts on pumping or constraints on pumping to protect the aquifer. At the end of the day, pumps won. So, you know, I don't know. But see, in a situation where you can have tradable water, in the case of surface water, you can actually move water through a market that's just not available for most of the world.
Yes. Hello. I very much enjoy your talk. I do agree on price tiers. One thing that I was wondering is if we start doing price tiering, wouldn't that activate like the price signal to get entrepreneurs to start finding new sources of water and maybe even developing infrastructure technology to increase the efficiency of water usage in general, lowering the price for everything in terms of water per usage through, like, let's say, entrepreneurial infrastructure programs?
The question was, I'm sorry, I just didn't quite, I got the gist of the statement. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to be able to offer there, but.
Thank you. So what opportunities in the future do you think there will be if there's a price tier systems for entrepreneurs to enter into the water market?
Well, I mean, it's already pretty evident, I think, that with rising prices, and those are the signals and the potential returns associated with them, that encourage investment and innovation and risking new technologies in ways of storing water, a way of moving water, and so forth. In some cases, it involves the purchase of water and moving it, and that has kind of community-wide effects, and so not always popular. And so I have thought that you might want to have some kind of extraction tax. I'm not happy to say that, but it could be a way to mitigate community-wide effects. In other words, if you're taking water out of a small community in some place and putting it in Lake Powell as a water bank, for example, then and a lot of people are saying, hey, you're making us dry. You're buying the water and making us dry. Well, this could be a way of sharing some of the benefit of that water reallocation, because it is importantly a benefit. But if you don't have prices and markets, then the opportunities for entrepreneurs are really squeezed. Okay, it's prices and markets and tradings and ability to capitalize on those that actually make the whole thing work. And that's why you get entrepreneurs who work in water and other things in this country, and you don't in many other places. People lament that they have all these water problems and they've had it forever, and I always wonder, well, why haven't they been solved? Well, there's no mechanism for them to solve it easily.
I can keep asking questions all day. Tell me when to stop. The basic question I had was, it seems that to get a pricing mechanism, normally you need property rights, because otherwise you really can't. It's a faux, market if there's no property rights. In our current water system, Yes, certainly. Our current water system is socialistic in that it's communally owned, and so there's no property rights. So do you see any movement to establishing any property rights? Like when I think of it like oil, there's definite property rights, and so there's a huge market, futures, you name it out there, but there's nothing like that with water.
Are you talking about aquifer groundwater, or are you talking about urban?
I'm talking about groundwater.
Well, yes.
There's some property rights.
Yes, and there'll be more. As water becomes more and more scarce, unless you get important state intervention to kind of make this too complicated to do, then I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, as water becomes more valuable,
sure,
it pays, as with other resources, it will pay to define and partition and so forth, and learn more about groundwater. Okay. I don't know how optimistic I am right at the moment in California with Sigma, because there are lots of things there. But Arizona, Utah, other states in the Colorado Basin, it just seems like such an obvious thing, and it's got to be happening. I just am not haven't been up on that literature. It's got to be happening, because it isn't just us in here who suddenly, hey, there's a crisis. No, people have been knowing about this, and it's paying people. And a lot of people are investing, and there are brokers and so forth. So, and in the Edwards Aquifer in Texas, the thing is partitioned, where you can trade and part of it, and not so much elsewhere. But there, pretty clear. The rights have been defined pretty clearly. You just can't trade them in some parts of it, but other parts you can.
We got several people.
I'd like to just shift the conversation from groundwater to river water, and specifically the Colorado River water. I think I'm right here that the lower states are taking far more water out of the Colorado River than is actually flowing into the, if that weren't the evidence is that Lake Mead keeps dropping, et cetera. So we're taking more out. I would think that the price of Colorado River water then should be going through the roof. I suspect that's not happening for lots of reasons, but could you comment on that?
Well, I think in many cases that is. In terms of ag water, there are brokers buying and selling water. There are advertisements, the kinds of things that weren't there 5 years ago. Now, one problem with water, or there are many problems with water, is there are no standard exchanges. It's not like buying real estate, where you go into a town and look at housing prices, and it's there you get some sense of how expensive housing is and so forth. Very fragmented. And in many cases, the state did not collect information on water exchanges and prices and so forth. We collected a price series some time ago, pieced it together from a variety of secondary sources. But those are really not ideal, and yet it's the only one I'm familiar with. Now, there are some important water brokers that do collect data, very proprietary about prices, but they have these reports, quarterly reports, and it's pretty clear prices are rising. So they're not flat. This isn't happening in a vacuum, and there are a lot of innovations in agriculture in terms of different kinds of center pivot irrigation devices and so forth that reduce, and even in Santa Barbara, they've been putting Israeli type, groundwater piping for various crops and so forth in the valley north of Santa Barbara. All that would not happen. It's expensive, and this water was really worth it. Now I don't know what they're doing with their excess water in these cases, if they're able to sell it easily or not. But there's a market signal out there that water is more valuable. The problem is in urban areas, we're not getting that in terms of consumers.
multiple times in the presentation you mentioned pretty hard to squeeze any more water out of agriculture, but yet that's the highest percentage there, so it makes sense that aren't there crops, and I've heard alfalfa, dates, almonds, aren't there crops that maybe should not be grown and other crops that should be grown for that purpose, and can't we squeeze agriculture?
Should in a value sense, or should in, I mean, I'm trying to get a sense of what would be the motivation there to close down almonds or
Pricing
alfalfa.
would do it.
What's that?
I said pricing would do it.
Well, of course, but I'm actually I'm a lot more confident about the price signals there. But I hear this a lot about almonds and things that I said at that dinner party were grapes, alfalfa. It could be very high valued ag. It might not be something you eat. You might not eat alfalfa, but you might eat beef or things that are fed alfalfa. But the remaining alfalfa that isn't already been given the rising prices, the remaining alfalfa that's been grown, my suspicion is done very efficiently and is very valuable. Now, I don't know that because I'm not an alfalfa grower. But I do read in terms of almond, Westlands is a big irrigation district in California on the west side. It has the least secure water rights, but it's the largest single almond grower in the country. They get every drop of water, because you can't take water from an orchard and say, this year we're going to fallow this orchard and next year put it back into production. That's it. Almonds are very high value for all sorts of health reasons and what have you. So, you could say we should. I mean, it has to be a value judgment, it seems to me. I don't know how much water you'd save if I got rid of all almonds. Some probably. But then what are you going to grow there? I mean, what seems to be acceptable that doesn't use as much water, especially if it's a lower valued use of water than the value of the water in almonds. So the key isn't the crop, although that gets picked up in the media quite a bit. The key is the value of the water that's used. And if it's socially valuable, economically valuable, it has a lot of employment, has a lot of communities built around it and so forth. I wouldn't at least I wouldn't say we shouldn't be growing that, because I don't know from an economist's point of view how I could possibly make that statement. As I mentioned, these irrigation districts are so incredibly astute about and sensitive to water issues, because it's primarily the thing. And of course, being in California, they have to live with Sacramento. They have to worry about this all the time. But they are very careful about this. And so my suspicion is that they are not wasteful in terms of the allocation of water. And if somehow it made more sense for them economically to shift some other crop, that they would do so. But almonds are very high valued and have a lot of health attributes and so forth. So big demand out there.
Thank you. I think I now have volume, yes. Okay. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I'd like all of us to thank Gary for taking the time with us to talk this through in a very detailed and calm and hopefully for you informative way. Thank you very much, Gary, for being here, and Brian for contributing as well. And we look forward to seeing you next year at events for the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty. We don't have a lineup yet, but it will be released before the fall semester starts. Thank you very much.
Yeah.